another edition of A Seat at the Table. And of course, for all of you who are wondering, having a seat at the table could be justice for all, or justice for some. You can be served with 100 years, or you can be served with a slap on the wrist. But if you don't have anybody to serve you, you can just sign your life away and just go ahead and make a deal. And many of us make deals because nobody's sitting at the table, is really there long enough, has way too many accounts, way too many cases. But there is someone who has dedicated his and obviously her life, but his life in particular, someone that's a real G. I say that just because at the end of the day, if you're in the trenches and you're creating soldiers and you literally know your soldiers are gonna burn out, they're gonna have to storm the wall. And it's a wall. Financial racism is a real disparity for those of you. And on the seat of the table, I am so proud. If there was a promise that there's somebody that's gonna at least tell the public defender and give them an ounce of the valor that they need to have, it is John Rapping. If there is someone who understands that there was a need and had a vision for the downtrodden to at least have a soldier, and there's a general who commands an army of public defenders who are waiting for that moment to explain why their heart hurts, their gas tank is empty, and yet they still have to show up at court and probably plead your son out because they don't have the time, nor do you have the money to do all those things to investigate the collision with justice for your son and justice in the room. So, my sister Skia, I know you're dedicated as much. I know that this is a moving moment for us. We know that Gideon's promise is a true promise for public defenders whose vision is to transform. So we want to talk about here at the seat of the table with my co-host, Kevin Hooks, how can we move this whole discussion of justice for all and social justice for public defenders forward without those individuals who are marginalized being, decapitated of their life, their future, and financial inequity that exists right now. I guess that's my first question. Why and how this beautiful vision, and I know you've entombed it with a phenomenal book. So share, and Kev has lots of great questions. So.
Well, you want me to start on?
You should start.
All right. So Munson, you did such a great job. I just need to have you come to Gideon's Promise, and you can be our spokesman. I don't need
you're in my home. I'm not inviting anybody.
Stand up for the 5 months, right?
No, I am not going to visit anybody. But you've got to respect people's moments. And, we've got a lot of charlatans that talk about they're there for justice. Public defenders only got one general and one person who is definitely stuck and dedicated his life. So, I'm not here about hot air. I'm missing my dinner. But clearly when a friend calls and she mentioned who it was, I know special people and a special person when I meet them and I see their work. Not what they say, because I'm not buying, you make your mouth say anything. But when your life talks, I respect what you have dedicated your life to.
Well, we appreciate that, Munson. And this is a special day for us. We're honored to be with you today. This is the day that our book, Gideon's Promise, which is the story of this movement we've been building for 15 years, dropped. And to your question, we moved to the South 15 years ago. I was a public defender in Washington, D.C. Ilham was an educator. And we came to Georgia because I became the training director for a statewide public defender system in Georgia. It was the first time Georgia would have a statewide system. 2 years later, Katrina hit, and I went to New Orleans to help with the effort to rebuild the public defender system there. I did some work in Alabama, Mississippi, and it was really my introduction to what criminal justice or criminal injustice looked like all across this country. It was eye-opening. And I've been a public defender my whole career, and I came down to train and mentor and support public defenders. And I started meeting these young, passionate lawyers. They came out of law school. They wanted to change the world. They were enthusiastic and idealistic. And they went into systems that had come to accept this embarrassingly low standard of justice for poor people. And before you know it, they had the spirit beaten out of them. And within a couple of years, they would either quit or they would start to become resigned to the status quo, right? They would just start becoming part of the problem, processing human beings through the system into cages. And so in 2007, I was fortunate to get a small grant from the George Soros Foundation. And I asked Illy, my wife, if she would take a year off of teaching,
1 year,
and help me build this organization that was going to be one program to help a handful of public defenders resist these systemic pressures to process. And she did. And now 13 years later, 14 years later, she has not gone back to teaching. She's the executive director of Gideon's Promise. I'm the president. We're a national model with 5 programs. And so, yeah, that's what it is. We're all about really building a movement of public defenders who can give voice to communities that have been deemed expendable, who can challenge assumptions of judges and prosecutors and system actors that have come to accept processing other people's children in a way that we never tolerate for our own, and building community and support so they can not only survive those systems, but collectively start to push back and transform them.
That's fantastic. You know, if I could steal a little bit from one of our greatest orators, you know, somewhere I read, all men were created equal. Somewhere I read that we were innocent until proven guilty. Somewhere I read that we had one justice system. That's not the experience that we face. Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you face, recognizing that none of that tends to apply to the poor and to the minority?
So, you know, John talked about, I started my career as an educator. And so I grew up in a very, low income community in upstate New York. And when I got introduced to the criminal justice system when I was 5 years old. My father came home from school and my mom told me my father would not be returning home. He would be gone a while. My father was arrested. He was charged, he was convicted, and he spent 10 years in Attica Correctional Facility, which was at that time and still is one of the worst state institutions in New York. And so how did he get there? It was this narrative that was created about people that looked like me, people who came from the communities where I grew up. Almost every man in my family had fallen victim to the criminal justice system. And so I could not figure out what was causing this. We were good people, right? We had very humble beginnings, but it was the narrative that the system had created about poor people and people of color. And so although my introduction was the criminal justice system, I think what I learned was that people like me didn't matter. And we were assigned lawyers, or my dad was given a public defender who really never told his story. Really never said what value he brought to the community, what the loss of him would have the impact on my family. And so I grew up thinking that people like me just didn't matter. And so when I left my hometown, it was to be an educator in the school to prison pipeline. And I started to recognize no matter how hard I worked, if we didn't have a safety net, which are public defenders, when those very kids that came from the communities where I grew up ended up in the system just because of circumstance, who was going to be the safety net to tell the story of that kid that we feel sorry for, that later becomes that adult that is in prison? And so it's just, for us, public defenders are the interrupters. They are the important and necessary need to keep kids like me growing up for having, no one around, no family, no dad, and the cycle continues if we don't stop it.
Kevin, can I just chime in on Illy's story? Because something that's so impactful about that story, Illy's father, he was arrested for crimes he committed years earlier. And by the time he was arrested, he turned his life around. He was a small business owner. He had converted to Islam. He had 3 children. Illy was the oldest at 5 with a 4th on the way. He was married. And what I find so interesting about that story is he got a public defender that I'm sure he didn't come into this work for the wrong reasons, but for whatever reason, by the time he met Elie's father, he was about processing people. He never told that story. And so a 5-year-old girl gets the message that her life doesn't matter. And the person who primarily delivered that message was a public defender. And what I came to realize, and what is really at the foundation of the work we do and we teach our public defenders, is when we stand next to a person, we're not just giving voice to that person, we are responsible for advocating for their families and their children and their communities to interrupt the system that lets 5-year-old children grow up believing they don't matter, because that's what the system tells them.
Yeah, well, a lot of people, believe that, Jesus died and he's coming back. But until that happens, we can't wait around for a Messiah to help solve these problems. What are some of the things we can do to start be solutions driven, start affecting change in the criminal justice system?
So, one thing that caused me to write the book was, for the last 5 years or so, the nation really has focused on criminal justice reform, and they've been talking about criminal justice reform. But a huge important piece of that conversation has been ignored, and that's public defenders. And what we hear is people talking about really how to address the symptoms of the problem with quick policy fixes. Symptoms like oppressive pretrial detention or draconian sentences or prosecutors who cheat. And we look at those symptoms and we propose some policy fix to address them. And what we're saying is we need to address those symptoms in the short run, but we have to recognize those are symptoms of a deeply rooted cultural problem. All of those symptoms stem from a culture, a narrative that says some communities, Black and brown communities, are dangerous, they're others. We need to keep them away from us, monitor them, police them, control them, lock them away. And if we don't change that narrative, we can have all the policy fixes we want. We'll find new ways to keep them away from us. And so what we understand is that narrative change only comes when there is someone who is invested in learning the stories, learning the people behind the cases, and amplifying those stories. Public defenders literally represent 80 to 90% of the people thrown into the criminal legal system. So collectively, they have the power to tell those stories, amplify those voices, infuse humanity into a system that is otherwise just destroying communities.
Is that one of those pauses, Munson?
That's my long pause.
It's a long pause.
You got mesmerized by it too.
It was a Munson does that when it's a drop the mic moment. He goes, okay, hold up. Let's sit. Let that breathe.
I think the importance, particularly today, is what are the three things that readers and professionals, moms and dads who really need to understand that these moments are around the corner and close. What are our three takeaways from this book? Because this is the moment. We're in a pandemic. Individuals can actually educate. Part of being in a movement is educating yourself to be able to be a part of a movement. So I think this is a movement maker. So what are the three things that they'll get so that they can advocate in their neighborhoods, in their communities, and support the vision of Gideon's Promise?
Well, I'll share three things that I think are takeaway from the book. One, as I just said, it's that the problem we're facing is a cultural problem that flows from a 400-year-old narrative that has shaped this country. And we have to realize that and not see this as a series of policy fixes. So one is, this is a cultural challenge. Two is, if we're going to address that cultural challenge, we need to change narrative. As Brian Stevenson, the great civil rights lawyer, says, he says, we can't have justice until we get proximate to the people who our decisions impact. And quite literally in the criminal legal system, public defenders are the vehicle through which judges and prosecutors get proximate to the human beings who their decisions impact. So that would be lesson 2 is, if we do not invest in public defenders, support public defenders, we're never going to get at the heart of culture. And then I think lesson 3 really is a lesson that I take from this moment. Because this book was written before we entered this moment where we're at the intersection of a global pandemic that has shined a glaring light on the fact that our society treats people who are poor terribly. We see people falling through the cracks who don't have jobs, they don't have health care. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the criminal justice system, where poor people are packed into cages because they don't have money to pay bond. And we've seen public defenders fighting every day to tell those stories and get people out of those cages. But that pandemic then intersects with a moment when we are finally reckoning with a history of racial oppression that really defines who we are as a nation. And I think when you see those two things, it has caused us as a nation to wake up and realize, I think, Kevin, as you were saying, these aspirations of all men are created equal, innocent until proven guilty, equal justice for all, that those really are aspirations that we're far from fulfilling. And we're watching young people. We have a 16-year-old daughter who's part of a movement of high school students of color in Atlanta called Teens Looking for Change. They're in the streets. They're advocating. They are activated in this moment. And what they realize is we appreciate policymakers and legislators who are making change, but if we don't all collectively take it upon ourselves to point out the very human toll that our actions have driven, we're not going to have real change. So I think those are 3 lessons I take from the book.
So, Dr. West always talks about, we're always arguing for peace and nobody's talking about justice. Dr. King said the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends toward justice, but does it really?
Well, look, I'd say this. Obviously, if history teaches us anything, it's that it may be bending towards justice, but it's still got a long way to go. But look, I'm an optimist. I think we both are. We wouldn't be doing this if we weren't optimistic. But what we also understand is that change is a long game. And what we say to our lawyers call us, Ilham and I get calls all the time from lawyers who say, I feel defeated. I think I'm gonna quit. Like I can't stand next to another human being whose life is just thrown away. And what we remind them is, when you stand up and you say, I'm not doing this again today, you may not get that tangible result that you want, but when you do that and your colleague does it in a courtroom next door and another person in the next county over, another group in the next state over, collectively you are pushing back, you're bending that arc a little closer to justice. You're changing mindset. And if we don't change mindset, it's a lost cause.
So how do we get there? What's the finish line look like? And how do we get there?
Well, I think in changing mindset, we can do it in our everyday, like quick fixes. And the thing, in the age that we're in, everyone wants to fix it and fix it right away, right? And you can't. This takes a long time. We now have people who we've worked with for 10 years, public defenders that were baby public defenders that are now 10 years later leading offices. Their entire office has created this culture change now, changing now, as the late Professor Bob said, the heart set, soul set, and mindset is what you need in public defense and changing hearts and minds. And I think it starts simply with what we train our lawyers. Our lawyers don't call their clients defendants, right? They don't call them case number, blah, 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 blah. The system is set up to dehumanize the person. And if you see them as a number or an orange jumpsuit, it is easy to throw them away. It is easy to put them in a case. So simply giving someone dignity by calling them by their name, Miss Asika, by picking up the phone and talking to their loved one who doesn't understand what's going on in the system. My mother didn't understand it. It would have been nice for her, my dad's public defender, to say, listen, Miss Asika, this is what's going to happen. This is what I need to know. This is what I'm going to do. And oftentimes just doing those simple things to show that you care about the person you're representing, that is something we can do, right? I think speaking out when you hear injustice, just like everyone's talking about, if you hear something racist, say that is racist, right? I think the same thing, when you see hundreds and hundreds of Black men being processed in preliminary hearings in courts all across the country, something is wrong with that. But no one is saying anything. And so I think just acknowledging the why is a good start, and asking why.
So you know, Kevin, there's a
John, hold up before you do that, John. That's powerful what Mrs. Skia said. But John, I need to hear from you. Malcolm talked about the idea of you can't stick a knife in my back 7 inches and pull it out 2 and call that progress. I'm sick of this incremental change. It's been 400 years. It's been more than 50 years since we started developing the prison industrial complex. How do we get out of this attitude that the way to solve problems of crime and the underserved community is to lock them up and throw away the key?
Well, I think that's exactly right. So I think, look, there is a need to push for immediate change to the extent that we can. And I think that people need to be making those legislative pushes, those policy pushes. But I also think we need to understand that you're not going to undo 400 years of a societal mindset overnight. And we can change the rules of the game, but if the people who are running the system still want to engineer the same result, they'll find a way to engineer it. And so while we're pushing for that change, Kevin, I think it is really critical that we are thinking about how we develop a generation of leaders to resist a narrative that really defines America. There's a story in this book I want to just quickly share about a public defender in Tennessee. He's the leader of a group of public defenders in Tennessee. He was elected by all the public defenders to be the president of the Tennessee Public Defender Commission. And he is testifying at a budget hearing, and he's asked a real simple question. Do you have enough resources? He says, let me tell you something. I've got a 5-county district. I have 5 courthouses. I have 5 lawyers and 1 investigator. He says, last year we closed 4,000 cases. That's 800 cases per lawyer. He goes on to say, so let me assure you there's 1 district in Tennessee that's blessed. He says, we have enough. He literally has become satisfied with that. And what I always say when I share that video with public defenders is I say, I don't believe that man came out of law school 30 years ago saying, you know what I want to do with my life? I think I want to help lock up 800 people a year. I think I'll become a public defender. He was very slowly and subtly shaped over time by a system that thinks that's all the justice poor people deserve. He was shaped into a lawyer he never would have recognized as a law student. So I teach law school at Atlanta's John Marshall. I teach my law students. We teach our lawyers. As Illy's saying, everybody we come across, we try to teach them that step 1 is you have to figure out how you don't let this system strip you of your ideals, right? Because the biggest problem we face is people in leadership who have come to lose sight of justice, and they're perpetuating it every day. So we need to groom a generation of leaders who have a clear vision for what justice is, have a culture change strategy, and are moving to finally write the narrative in America that matches the ideals you talked about, Kevin.
That's beautiful. Listen, I keep
I'm enjoying the conversation. I think the book is important. I think the challenge is pay. I mean, when we say it, I just want people to know if you're a public defender and you're gonna make 70 grand a year, I don't know what the money is, but and have 800 cases, I don't know. You might start chasing some ambulance at that moment.
Right, that ROI is horrible.
And that's why I think we both say this. We're the luckiest people in the world. Aside from having 2 amazing children and an organization that we've built together, we're surrounded by, I think, real life heroes, right? These public defenders, as you say, they come out of law school. These folks could go get jobs paying $150,000 a year. They take jobs that pay $40,000, $50,000 a year, crushing student loans. They work 70 hours a week. They're disrespected, but they keep on pushing because they know this is the most important work that can be done in a legal system. And the fact is, no one can survive doing that alone. No one can survive in a vacuum. And so again, it goes back to this book, it goes back to the organization. What we're about is building a supportive community that can continue to inspire people to do that while they have the support to do it. What started with 16 lawyers from 2 offices is now over 1,000 public defenders from more than half the states in the country, a statewide partnership in Maryland. We're building a partnership in Texas. It's been 14 years, right? But that's how long it takes for change.
So I keep asking these pie in the sky, 50,000 feet questions. I want to get more granular. Is it as simple as, providing more resources for the public defenders, higher pay, smaller caseloads, a better understanding of what their power really is? Because I feel like my experience, I have cousins, my brother's currently doing 57 years. I've got 2 cousins in Oklahoma one is doing 30 years, the other one's doing double life. But the public defenders basically walked in and had already lost the case. So is it as simple as more resources?
Now, let me first say, Kevin, I'm sorry, man. I mean, that is your story is just unfortunately a common story that public defenders see and hear all the time. And I think when you're hearing that every day, without a counter message, you begin to become numb to it. And so you're right. You could give those lawyers that represented your loved ones, you could triple their pay and cut their caseloads in half. You could triple the pay of this public defender in Tennessee I talked about, cut his caseload in half. He'd go home at lunchtime. He wouldn't know what to do with the rest of his day because he never learned what it means to be a real advocate. So increasing pay, giving more resources, that's critical, but it's absolutely not enough. That's got to be coupled with what we're working on, which is grooming a community of lawyers to reimagine what it means to be a public defender, partnering with communities, respecting the communities you serve, respecting their voice, seeing your job as their servant, not a person who dictates to them what should happen to them in the criminal legal system.
But the problem is, the other side of it, conversely, is you've got a whole generation of people in the system who have these, what I consider to be strange ideas. My cousin, for example, refused to take a plea deal because they called it snatching out. And he was like, only punks snatch out, and I quote. And so he was like, I'm gonna take it to trial and see what happens. Well, he got double life. Like, I'm like, if they offer you 25 with a chance of parole, and you've got somebody who's your advocate, not your lawyer, who's telling you all of the information that you need to make a sound decision, maybe we make better decisions. So I feel like it's two-sided. Is that some of your experience as well?
I mean, look, I would say it's 2 sides, but of the same coin. So I really do believe that oftentimes people in the system make bad decisions because they don't trust their lawyer. Again, not because their lawyer is a bad person. Their lawyer is so overwhelmed, so under-resourced, so beaten down that after a while, they're just going through motions. And if you don't trust your lawyer, you start looking for any advice you can get. And if it's advice from people inside, it might not be great advice. So until we develop lawyers who really do respect the people they serve, love the people they serve, are committed to the people they serve, and earn the trust. So those people say, man, I'm not listening to you. I'm listening to my lawyer because that person has my back. The problem you described, Kevin, is going to continue.
Yeah. So Gideon's Promise, the book. How would you define that if you're standing in front of a law school and you're sharing with not only them, but with their parents and they've graduated? What and why should they read this book so that they are prepared to understand what your promise is to them inside this book? Because this is part of our movement.
So I'm going to take a crack at that, and then I'll let Illy take a crack as well. I mean, I think for me, if I'm standing there with the book and I see students and their families and they say, what is this book about? To me, what it's about is saying, look, if you're going to be a lawyer and you're going to law school, learn the law, learn the rules. But sometimes in law school, we can reduce lawyering to legal rules and doctrine, right? You could go through a first year curriculum as a law student, read hundreds of cases, and literally not know the story of anyone behind the case. And what I would say is this book is going to help you understand that what you're going to get in law school is part of what you need to be a lawyer. But if you don't find a way to nurture your passion and your purpose, to remain an empathetic and compassionate person, you will come out of law school and inevitably be part of the problem. So what this book is about is how to be a lawyer that is also a change agent. It's not enough to just be a technically skilled lawyer. You have to be a lawyer that has an analysis, a spirit, and a philosophy about how we lift up folks who have been left behind and how we collectively move to really drive change. That's what I think the book is about. Illy probably thinks the book's really about
me.
Her.
No, no. But I also want to add to being an interrupter. I think what we are finding right now, especially with the generation that's out protesting every day, is they're starting to understand what it means to interrupt a system, right? This system was designed, it was intentionally designed this way. I believe, and I started saying this publicly a year ago, it should be dismantled, right? We need to start over. And that's like Kevin, you said, that's 50 feet in the air, but it's designed to process people, it's designed to process us. But I would say that not just to law students, but I would also say, I truly believe it is the answer to transform the criminal justice system, not just public defenders, but I think you can also apply this model that he's talking about, this culture change model, instead of values-based recruitment, values-based training, values-based support and mentorship. You can use it for prosecutors. You can reform police departments. You can reform the marshal offices. You can reform the probation and parole office. Because if you start changing the hearts and mindsets of people, and those folks who are supposed to administer justice start recognizing the people they see every day as human beings, you can change the system. And so I would say it is the answer to transforming the criminal legal system.
That's why she's the executive director. See that?
So, Mrs. Skeeler, I gotta know, the book is about you. When somebody reads that book, what I want to know is, what do you want them to walk away? If there's one nugget, one gem, that when they finish that book and they close it at the end, what do you want them to walk away feeling?
I want them to feel that they can go out and do something. I think it gives you some answers of what concretely you can go do. You can go speak up about injustice. And you don't have to be a lawyer to do it. I am not a lawyer. And I've been doing this work for 14, 15 years because I believe in reform. I believe in justice. And so I think that's what I would say is go do something, action.
And you know, Kevin, I think Illy makes such an important point. She says she's not a lawyer. One thing we always say is when we talk about public defenders, you don't have to be a lawyer. When we talk about public defenders, to us, public defender is any professional working as part of an organization, part of a community to provide representation, to give voice to poor people accused of crimes who have nowhere else to turn. And that includes investigators, social workers, mitigation specialists, support staff. Conversely, there are many lawyers who stand next to someone in court charged with a crime who do not deserve the title public defender. Public defender does not just mean you have a bar card. Public defender, as Illy said, is a heart set, mindset, soul set. It's a way of seeing this work and respecting the people we serve. So I think that's a really critical thing that also I would hope people take away from the book. The other thing you got to take away from the book.
I was going to say one thing. It's civil rights work. right? That's why
Yeah.
Brian endorsed it. That's why James Foreman Jr. endorsed it. Public defense work is civil rights work. So that's, Kevin, that's my three words that you would take from this book.
And the last thing I have to say is you read this book and you realize nobody can do this without support, because I think you see in this book, we've been a team, right? We're not just married, we've been a team in this fight for 15 years. And there's not a day that both of us aren't thinking about quitting. And that's with the support, right? This takes a lot of support. It's just too hard to stand up to injustice every single day and not get beaten down and have your spirit worn thin without support.
That's great. Much of that, I know that all too well about the whole every day you want to reevaluate your life choices.
No, I want to thank you for coming on a seat at the table. I think that for all change agents who are out there and you're wondering what you should be reading or studying, I think Gideon Promise gives us a vision of ourselves and a vision of what our community needs to adjust. So I think those who are looking for justice, that is both in the police department, public defender's office, public safety, anything that could move this movement and our movement forward, I think this is what I hear, at least what I've heard. Because when you say it's civil rights, many forget how the law plays a real role, but many forget how we need to change our hearts. I'm just glad you put something in a book so that individuals can study what they need to do from somebody who has the level of compassion that the two of you have, to at least adhering to a promise that all men and women who stand there have public defenders who will give them dignity, who will give them courage, and then public defenders that have enough valor to stand up to a system that they know is already against them. So I want to thank you both for coming on a seat at the table. Look forward to catching up with you post-COVID, but enjoyed welcoming you to home. Look forward to having another discussion during our RIDE conference so we can talk about legal change agents and how this book can be applied as well. So thank you so much to both of you. Great to see you, John. Very nice to meet you. And I really want to make sure that I don't mess up your name. But thank you very much. I all much respect to you and this motion, and anybody listening. Take a moment and just go find this book. If not, we'll be hosting and having another engagement so that we can really promote this beautiful book for all change agents. Take a look at Gideon's Promise and make a difference in your life by making a difference in joining their movement. If you haven't figured out how, this is it today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Kevin, you everybody in your family, is anybody that ain't in jail, bro?
Me.
Because you're talking about real, you're the only person decided not to, huh?
Yeah, I had to make a different choice. I ain't built for it. You know, I got a whole family that's built for it, apparently. I'm not built for it.
Right. Well, for all of you who've been wondering what to do, Gideon's Promise is one of those things that you should do. Here at the seat at the table, we have one thing to send you home on. You do not have to be in the streets, but you do have to be in the struggle. I'm Munson Steed, and we'll see you tomorrow. Kevin Hooks, my co-host, and obviously to the entire team at Gideon's Promise, we thank you so much for coming on a seat at the table tonight. Thank you. Good night.